Imagine booking a flight, minding your own business, only to be told your seat isn't really yours. Would you fight for it? Or would you let it go to make things easier? What happened on this plane left everyone watching and changed more than just one passenger's journey. Stay tuned. You won't believe how this flight really landed. The morning air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm toast as Delilah Carter sat by her small kitchen table. The golden sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden surface. She traced the rim of her coffee mug with her finger, lost in thought. Today was supposed to be simple. A flight to New York, a family gathering, and most importantly, her son's wedding. She took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle in her chest. The invitation had arrived months ago, neatly printed with elegant cursive writing. Together with their families, Marcus Carter and Elaine Jennings invite you to celebrate their wedding. She had read it over and over, the words carrying a mix of joy and something else, an ache she hadn't quite expected. For years, it had just been her and Marcus. She had raised him alone, worked hard as a teacher, and made sure he had everything he needed. Now he was building his own life, moving forward, and though she was proud, there was a quiet hesitation inside her. Was she ready to let go? She exhaled, shaking off the thought. She wasn't about to let her emotions cloud what was meant to be a celebration. Instead, she focused on the practical things, her suitcase neatly packed by the door, her travel itinerary tucked into her purse, and her flight scheduled for early afternoon. She had always been the kind of person who planned ahead. Organization brought her comfort, a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, her neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, stood there, a kind smile on her wrinkled face. "You all set for your trip, Delilah?" she asked, adjusting the shawl draped over her shoulders. Delilah nodded. "Just about. I've got everything packed and ready to go." Mrs. Holloway peered inside, eyes landing on the packed suitcase. "You must be excited. Your boy's wedding. What a big moment." "It is," Delilah admitted, her smile softening. "I can hardly believe it." Mrs. Holloway reached out, giving her a gentle squeeze on the arm. "Enjoy every minute of it, and don't let any nonsense get in the way of celebrating." Delilah knew exactly what she meant. Living in a small southern town had taught her that people like her, black women, especially those who carried themselves with quiet dignity, had to navigate spaces carefully. Some moments reminded her that even in 2025, the world hadn't entirely changed, but she refused to dwell on it. Today was about Marcus, about family, about happiness. As she checked the time, she realized it was almost time to leave. She double-checked her belongings, ensuring she had her ID, boarding pass, and a book for the flight. She always brought a book. It was her way of keeping the world at bay when she needed a moment to herself. Before she left, she took one last look around her home, a place filled with memories of raising Marcus. The framed photographs on the wall, the slightly worn couch where they had watched movies together, the kitchen where she had spent countless mornings making breakfast for him before school. A deep breath, a nod to herself. Then she picked up her suitcase and stepped out the door, locking it behind her. The drive to the airport was smooth, and by the time she arrived, she felt that familiar mixture of excitement and anticipation. She checked in, went through security, and soon found herself at the gate, waiting for her flight. She glanced around, observing the people around her. Business travelers buried in their laptops, families juggling kids and luggage, elderly couples holding hands as they waited for their boarding call. Airports always fascinated her, so many lives intersecting, each person carrying their own story, their own destination. She let her mind wander, imagining what Marcus must be doing at this moment, probably making last-minute arrangements, double-checking the details with Elaine. He had always been meticulous, just like her. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the boarding process. She stood, rolling her suitcase behind her as she joined the line. As she handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant, she allowed herself a small smile. New York, a wedding, a moment she had been waiting for. She had no idea that this flight would be far from ordinary. The jet bridge had the familiar hum of air conditioning as Delilah stepped onto the plane, adjusting the strap of her purse. She moved with quiet confidence, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant at the entrance. "Welcome aboard." the woman said automatically, barely glancing up as she gestured toward the aisle. Delilah was used to this, certain courtesies given without real acknowledgement. She let it slide, focusing instead on finding her seat. She had booked an aisle seat toward the middle of the plane, preferring the extra space. As she walked down the narrow aisle, maneuvering past passengers stowing their luggage, she glanced at her boarding pass again. 17C, but when she reached her row, someone was already sitting there. A middle-aged white man, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, sat comfortably in the seat she had reserved. His leather briefcase rested against the seat in front of him, and he was casually scrolling through his phone, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was in the wrong place. Delilah hesitated for a brief moment, then cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, sir. I believe this is my seat." She gestured toward the boarding pass in her hand, her voice calm but firm. The man barely looked up. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, still focused on his screen. "You sure?" he muttered, shifting slightly, but making no effort to move. Delilah's patience, honed by years of teaching high school students who thought they knew everything, remained steady. "Yes, I'm sure. 17 degrees Celsius. Right here." He sighed, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes flickered with something, a slight annoyance, a quiet challenge. "Well, I was hoping to keep this seat. You don't mind taking the one next to the window, do you?" She did mind. She had chosen the aisle seat for a reason. It wasn't about preference alone. It was about comfort, about having control over her space, about avoiding the discomfort of squeezing past others just to get up. She kept her voice even. "I'd prefer to sit in the seat I booked." The man sighed again, this time louder, as if she were the one inconveniencing him. "Look, it's not a big deal. It's the same row." Delilah held her ground. "Sir, I reserved 17C. That's my seat." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but before he could respond, a voice chimed in. "Is there a problem here?" Delilah turned her head and saw a flight attendant approaching, Kendra Monroe. She was in her early 30s, tall, with perfectly styled blonde hair tucked into a neat bun. The navy blue uniform fit snugly, her name tag pinned neatly on her chest. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Delilah's attention. It was her demeanor. Kendra walked with a kind of authority that wasn't just about doing her job. There was something else beneath the surface, something rigid. Before Delilah could explain, the man in her seat spoke first. "Oh, no issue at all," he said smoothly, flashing a smile that came too easily. "Just a little misunderstanding. I was hoping to swap seats with the lady here, but she seems to really want this one." His tone was light, casual, painting the situation as if Delilah were the unreasonable one. Kendra turned to Delilah, an unreadable expression on her face. "Ma'am, are you okay with switching seats? It would make things easier." Easier for who? Delilah felt something tighten in her chest, the way Kendra phrased it, as if she were the one causing a disruption, as if she should be the one to bend. She kept her tone polite, controlled. "I'm just asking to sit in the seat I reserved." Kendra's gaze lingered on her, a fraction longer than necessary. "I understand, but it's just a small adjustment. If you don't mind, we can get everyone settled faster." Delilah inhaled slowly. She knew this game. It was the kind of request that wasn't really a request. It was an expectation, wrapped in a polite tone. A familiar, unspoken rule. Don't make a fuss. Don't inconvenience others. Don't be difficult. But she wasn't being difficult. She was asking for what was rightfully hers. She shook her head. "No, I'd like to sit in my assigned seat." The moment stretched between them. The man in the seat huffed, shifting as if he were the one being pressured. Kendra's expression remained composed, but her lips pressed together slightly, just enough for Delilah to notice. "All right," Kendra finally said, her voice clipped. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move." The man groaned but got up, grabbing his briefcase with exaggerated effort. He muttered something under his breath, something Delilah didn't quite catch but didn't need to. She had heard that tone before. She slid into her seat as he settled into the window seat, shaking his head as if he'd been inconvenienced beyond reason. Kendra lingered for just a second longer before walking away, her posture stiff. Delilah exhaled, trying to shake off the weight of the exchange. She hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, the moment left a residue, a quiet discomfort, a reminder that fairness wasn't always given freely. She pulled out her book, but her eyes hovered over the pages without absorbing the words. The plane continued boarding around her, passengers shuffling to their seats, the hum of conversation filling the space. She told herself to let it go. It was just a seat. But deep down she knew it was never just a seat. The plane had settled into a steady hum, the kind of background noise that faded into a rhythm once you got used to it. Delilah tried to lose herself in the book resting in her lap, but the words swam together. Her mind kept replaying the interaction from earlier, the man's reluctance to move, Kendra's hesitation, the unspoken expectation that she should be the one to yield. She had faced moments like this before, subtle yet sharp. It wasn't about a single incident. It was the accumulation of a lifetime of small slights, dismissals, and expectations placed upon her simply because of who she was. The man next to her had wasted no time making his displeasure known. He huffed, adjusted his position repeatedly, and shifted in his seat with exaggerated annoyance, each movement a silent protest. A flight attendant passed by offering drinks, and when she reached their row, she greeted him first. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" He barely glanced up. "Black coffee." The attendant nodded before turning to Delilah. "And for you, ma'am?" She was about to order tea when the man muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Unbelievable." Delilah turned her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Excuse me." He finally looked at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Nothing," he said, but the smirk tugging at his lips told a different story. She knew what this was. He hadn't forgotten about their earlier interaction. Some people just couldn't stand the idea of being told no. Rather than engage, she let out a slow breath, shifting her attention back to her book. She had no intention of wasting her energy on someone who had already made up his mind about her. A few rows ahead, Kendra was speaking with another passenger. Her voice carried over the hum of the plane, light and professional, but there was something about her posture, rigid, controlled. Delilah had met women like her before, women who believed they were simply enforcing the rules, but somehow only seemed to enforce them in one direction. She took a sip of the tea that had been placed in front of her and forced herself to let it go. She was here for one reason, to see her son get married. Nothing else was going to take up space in her head. But then something happened that made letting go impossible. A few seats behind her, a flight attendant, one Delilah hadn't seen before, was crouching next to an elderly white woman. "I'm so sorry about the mix-up," the attendant said. "Would you prefer an aisle seat? We can accommodate that." Delilah froze. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the situation unfolding, without making it obvious she was paying attention. The older woman smiled kindly. "Oh, that would be lovely. I do have trouble getting up sometimes." "Of course," the attendant reassured her. "Let me check with the crew. I'm sure we can find a solution." Delilah's fingers curled around the edge of her book. So when it was someone else, a white woman, the same airline that had insisted she should switch his seats without hesitation, was now going out of its way to accommodate her comfort. Her grip tightened, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She wouldn't let anger take over, not yet. She waited, watching as the flight attendant walked toward the front, presumably to arrange the seat change. Delilah felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a familiar burden, one that she had carried too many times before. She glanced toward Kendra, wondering if she had noticed, wondering if she cared. And for the first time since stepping onto the plane, Delilah felt something shift inside her. She wasn't going to let this pass unnoticed. Delilah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, steady and familiar, like an old coat she had worn too many times before. She watched in quiet disbelief as the flight attendant arranged a seat change for the elderly white woman, her voice warm and accommodating. The contrast was sharp. The same airline that had treated her request as an inconvenience was now bending over backward to ensure another passenger's comfort. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. It wasn't just about the seat. It never was. It was about the way people like her were expected to accommodate others, to shrink themselves, to avoid making a fuss, to accept less. The man beside her shifted again, clearly aware of the tension. He didn't look at her, but Delilah could feel his smug satisfaction in the way he stretched his legs a little too far into the aisle. She closed her book, setting it aside. This wasn't something she could just let slide. Gathering herself, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The moment she did, she felt eyes flicker toward her, a silent expectation that she would sit back down, that she wouldn't cause trouble. But she wasn't looking for permission. She walked with quiet determination toward the front of the plane, past rows of passengers who barely registered her movement. As she approached the flight attendant's station, she saw Kendra Monroe standing near the beverage cart, flipping through paperwork. Delilah stopped a few feet away, waiting. It took a moment for Kendra to look up. Her polite, professional mask slipped into place instantly. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Delilah didn't bother with pleasantries. "I have a question." Kendra tilted her head slightly, a flicker of hesitation crossing her features. "Of course." Delilah kept her tone even. "Earlier, when I asked to sit in the seat I reserved, I was told switching seats would make things easier. But now I see another passenger being accommodated without hesitation. Can you explain the difference?" There it was. The pause, the slight tightening of Kendra's jaw. She recovered quickly, her voice smooth. "Ma'am, we do our best to accommodate all passengers when possible." Delilah didn't blink. "But not me." A silence settled between them, brief but heavy. Kendra inhaled, straightening her posture. "I assure you there was no intention to—" Delilah cut her off. "Don't explain it to me. Just think about it." Kendra's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance? Guilt? It was hard to tell. Delilah didn't wait for a response. She turned, walking back to her seat, her heart steady but her mind racing. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't need to, but she had made it clear that she saw what had happened. And that mattered. As she sat down, the man beside her glanced at her, smirking. "Feel better now?" Delilah met his gaze without hesitation. "Not yet," she said, and she meant it. Delilah settled back into her seat, but her mind remained restless. The encounter with Kendra left a weight in her chest. Not just frustration, but something sharper, something that had been building over years of these moments, stacking on top of each other. She glanced at the man beside her. He had gone back to scrolling on his phone, his earlier smirk still lingering as if he thought he had won some invisible battle. Let him think that. She knew better than to waste her energy on men like him. Instead, she turned her focus back to the flight attendants. She wanted to see what Kendra would do next. A few rows ahead, Kendra was speaking with another attendant, a man, younger, his name tag reading David Harper. David looked over toward Delilah's row as Kendra spoke to him, his brow furrowed slightly, his expression somewhere between confusion and curiosity. She didn't know what Kendra was saying, but she could guess. People like Kendra never liked to be called out. Delilah turned her head back toward the window, watching the sky beyond the small oval pane. Clouds stretched out below them, endless and soft. A few minutes later, footsteps approached. "Excuse me, ma'am." Delilah turned, expecting Kendra. But it was David. His tone was polite, professional, but there was something else there, a quiet uncertainty. "I just wanted to check in," he said. "Is everything all right?" Delilah studied him for a moment. He looked young, maybe mid-30s, his expression open in a way that Kendra's had never been. "Define all right," she said evenly. David hesitated, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken. "I heard there was a concern earlier about seating arrangements. I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable now." Comfortable. The word sat oddly in her ears. "Tell me something, Mr. Harper," she said. "Do you check in on every passenger after a seating disagreement? Or just the ones who don't let it go quietly?" David exhaled through his nose, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Not amusement, but something close to understanding. "You're right," he admitted. "We don't always handle things the way we should. And sometimes we notice things too late." That was more than she had expected. She studied him a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Noted." David straightened. "If you need anything, let me know." She appreciated that he didn't try to smooth things over with empty apologies. He wasn't excusing it, but he was acknowledging it. And sometimes that was the first step. As he walked away, Delilah caught Kendra watching from across the cabin. Their eyes met. Kendra looked away first. Delilah turned back to her book, but this time, she actually read the words. Delilah flipped a page in her book, though she wasn't really reading. Her mind lingered on the exchange with David Harper, the quiet acknowledgement in his voice. It wasn't much, but it was more than what she'd come to expect. Still, she wasn't naive enough to think that a few words could undo a lifetime of these moments. She let her gaze drift across the cabin. The plane had settled into a peaceful hum, passengers engrossed in books, conversations reduced to murmurs, the occasional rustling of snack bags. It was the kind of stillness that made it easy to believe that nothing was wrong. But Delilah had learned long ago, just because something was quiet didn't mean it was right. A few rows ahead, Kendra moved methodically down the aisle, distributing drinks. She carried herself with that same composed authority, but Delilah noticed the stiffness in her shoulders. She wondered if Kendra felt exposed, unsettled by their earlier exchange. Good. Delilah shifted slightly in her seat, pressing her hand against the hardcover of her book. She wasn't someone who looked for trouble, but she also wasn't the kind of woman who ignored it when it found her. And then, as if on cue, something happened. A passenger across the aisle, a man in his 60s, heavy-set with salt and pepper hair, began shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His breathing grew uneven, his hand pressing against his chest. Delilah noticed before anyone else. She set her book down immediately. "Sir, are you all right?" He didn't answer. His face had gone pale, his eyes fluttering as he struggled to focus. A woman beside him, a younger passenger in her 30s, leaned forward. "Dad?" she asked, alarm creeping into her voice. By now, other passengers were turning their heads, sensing something was wrong. Kendra approached quickly, her professional composure slipping into concern. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. Delilah acted before she had time to second-guess herself. "I think he's having trouble breathing," she said. "He needs help now." Kendra looked at her, as if weighing whether or not to trust her judgment. Delilah didn't wait for permission. She unbuckled her seatbelt, moving across the aisle, her instincts kicking in. Years of teaching had given her a sharp awareness of emergencies. She had seen students faint, panic attacks, medical scares in classrooms where she had to react before help arrived. She knew how to stay calm when things went wrong. And right now, this man needed someone to stay calm. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice to something steady, soothing, "can you squeeze my hand?" A weak grip. That was good. He was still responsive. "We need to get him some oxygen," Delilah said, glancing up at Kendra. Kendra hesitated for a fraction of a second. Too long. Delilah turned sharply to the younger flight attendant standing nearby. "David, get the oxygen mask." David didn't hesitate. He turned and moved. A moment later, he returned with the emergency oxygen tank. Delilah helped to position the mask over the man's face, keeping her voice steady as she reassured the daughter beside him. "It's going to be okay. The oxygen should help stabilize him until we land." The tension in the cabin was thick. Passengers watched, hushed, waiting. Delilah focused only on the man in front of her. She wasn't a doctor, but she knew how to help. She knew how to take control when others froze. And Kendra? Kendra was frozen. It was only when Delilah looked up again that she saw the shift in Kendra's expression. Not just concern, but something else. Recognition. Kendra was seeing her in a way she hadn't before, and Delilah wasn't sure what to do with that. Not yet. The cabin remained unnervingly quiet, every passenger's attention locked on the man now breathing through the oxygen mask. His color was returning, the tightness in his face loosening just a little. His daughter sat beside him, gripping his arm, her wide eyes darting between Delilah and the flight attendants. "He's stabilizing," Delilah reassured her, keeping her voice steady. "The oxygen is helping." The young woman nodded, exhaling shakily. "Thank you." David knelt beside them, adjusting the flow of oxygen, while Kendra stood frozen for a beat too long. Delilah didn't miss it, the hesitation, the internal struggle flickering behind her eyes. But Delilah didn't have time to focus on Kendra's discomfort. This wasn't about Kendra. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical situation on board. If there are any medical professionals on the flight, please notify a crew member immediately." A few rows ahead, an older woman in a blazer raised a hand. "I'm a nurse," she called. David gestured for her to come forward, and she hurried over, immediately assessing the man. Delilah stepped back, letting the nurse take over, but she stayed close enough to assist if needed. The crisis wasn't over, but the immediate danger had passed. And yet, the air around her felt heavier. She could feel Kendra watching her. Delilah turned, and for the first time since stepping onto the plane, she saw something new in Kendra's face, a crack in the composed mask, a realization. Delilah met her gaze evenly. "You froze," she said quietly. Kendra's lips parted slightly, but no words came. David shifted beside them, clearly sensing the tension. He cleared his throat. "I'm going to inform the captain that the situation is under control," he said before stepping away, leaving them standing there. Delilah didn't move. Kendra swallowed, her throat bobbing. "I was assessing the situation." Delilah let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "No, you weren't. You hesitated." Kendra stiffened. "I—" Delilah didn't wait for the excuse. "That man could have lost consciousness while you were standing there deciding whether or not to act." Kendra flinched, her perfectly polished exterior cracking just a little more. Delilah tilted her head slightly. "Tell me something, Miss Monroe. If I had been the one in distress, would you have hesitated then?" The question landed between them like a weight. Kendra opened her mouth, but no answer came. And that silence, it told Delilah everything she needed to know. She didn't need Kendra's apology. She didn't need her validation. But she needed her to sit with that silence and understand it. Delilah exhaled, then turned, making her way back to her seat. She had done what needed to be done. And Kendra, she would have to figure out what to do with the truth now staring her in the face. The tension in the air lingered, even as the hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin once more. The passengers had started to settle back into their routines, some murmuring among themselves, others stealing glances toward the man, who was now breathing steadily under the nurse's care. Delilah sat back in her seat, her fingers grazing over the worn edge of her book, but she wasn't reading. Her mind was still back there, standing face to face with Kendra Monroe, watching the woman struggle with something she couldn't bring herself to say. She didn't need an apology. She just wanted Kendra to realize what had happened, to actually see it for what it was. She could still feel the weight of Kendra's silence. Across the aisle, the man she had helped was now sitting up, his daughter's hand resting on his arm. Delilah caught the young woman's gaze and gave a small nod. The woman mouthed a soft, "Thank you." Delilah offered a reassuring smile. She wasn't looking for gratitude, but it was nice to be seen. A shadow passed beside her, and she glanced up. Kendra. She was standing stiffly in the aisle, her posture still composed, but her hands were clasped tightly together. A tell, Delilah realized, a sign that something was shifting inside her. For a second, Kendra hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak. But then, with an exhale, she said, "I wanted to check in, to see if you needed anything." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement of what had just happened, but it was something. Delilah considered her for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I'm fine." Kendra gave a short nod and stepped away, disappearing toward the front of the plane. Delilah let out a slow breath. She hadn't expected a transformation. People didn't change overnight. But something had cracked, and sometimes that was the first step. She reached for her book again, this time actually reading the words on the page. But she knew this flight wasn't over yet, and neither was this story. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the quiet murmurs of conversation. Delilah had returned to her book, but she wasn't truly reading. Her mind was still turning over everything that had happened. She had expected discomfort, maybe even frustration. But what she hadn't expected was the way Kendra had approached her, the hesitation in her voice. "I wanted to check in, to see if you needed anything." A small gesture, but a shift nonetheless. Delilah exhaled, closing her book. She had spent enough of her life watching people like Kendra navigate these moments, always choosing to brush past the uncomfortable truths rather than face them head on. But this time, Kendra had been forced to stand in that silence, forced to feel the weight of what had happened. And that was something. She turned her head slightly, watching as Kendra moved through the cabin, checking on passengers with practiced efficiency. But Delilah could see it now, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her movements weren't quite as smooth as before. Kendra was thinking. Good. Delilah adjusted her seat, letting her body relax. Maybe, just maybe, this flight would end without further incidents. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A few rows ahead, a passenger, a young man in his late 20s, wearing a gray hoodie and noise-canceling headphones, suddenly raised his voice. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, yanking his headphones down. His face twisted in frustration as he glared at his phone screen. Several passengers turned their heads. Delilah watched as Kendra, still on edge from their earlier interaction, straightened her spine and moved toward the man. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked, her tone professional, but there was a tightness in her voice. The man scoffed. "Yeah, there's a problem. Your Wi-Fi is garbage. I just lost my connection mid-call." Delilah inwardly sighed. Kendra blinked, clearly thrown off by the sheer pettiness of the complaint. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir, but in-flight Wi-Fi can be unstable depending on—" "That's not good enough," the man interrupted, his voice rising. "I paid for this service. I expect it to work." Delilah knew exactly what was about to happen. The privilege of inconvenience, the way some people acted as if minor frustrations were full-scale injustices, while others had to fight just to be acknowledged. She could see the shift in Kendra's expression, could almost see the realization dawning, the unspoken contrast between this man's loud, entitled demands and Delilah's earlier, much more justified concern. This wasn't just about Wi-Fi. This was about how the world responded to certain people differently. Kendra squared her shoulders. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but I need you to lower your voice." The man scoffed again. "Or what? You'll kick me off the flight?" Delilah didn't move. She didn't need to, because Kendra was standing in it now. She was facing, in real time, the truth Delilah had tried to make her see. And from the way Kendra's jaw tightened, Delilah knew. She finally saw it. The young man in the hoodie crossed his arms, shifting in his seat like an impatient child. "So, what's the solution here?" he demanded, "because I didn't pay for a service that only works half the time." Kendra's expression didn't waver, but Delilah noticed the slight shift in her body language, an awareness, a tension that hadn't been there before. "I understand your frustration, sir," Kendra said, her voice carefully measured. "However, the Wi-Fi connection can be affected by altitude and location. There's nothing we can do to fix it mid-flight." "That's ridiculous," he scoffed, tossing his phone onto the tray table. "Unacceptable." The privilege of inconvenience. Delilah had seen this before. How some people thought the world owed them flawless service, immediate answers, unwavering attention. She watched Kendra, waiting. Because this was the real test. Kendra could walk away, let the man continue his little tantrum. She could placate him, offer him some compensation, the same way she had expected Delilah to step aside earlier, to take the path of least resistance. Or she could hold her ground. For the first time since boarding, Delilah saw something shift behind Kendra's eyes. A realization, a choice. "Sir," Kendra said, her voice firmer now, "I need you to lower your voice and remain respectful. The Wi-Fi issue is not something we can resolve at this moment." The man let out an exasperated laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Oh, come on, this is unbelievable." Passengers were watching now, but Kendra didn't back down. "If you continue to raise your voice, I'll have to escalate this matter with the captain." Delilah didn't hide her small, knowing smile. There it was, a moment of consistency. For the first time, Kendra wasn't just enforcing the rules when it was convenient, she was holding this man to the same expectations. The man rolled his eyes, grumbling under his breath, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he grabbed his phone again, putting his headphones back on, clearly deciding that fighting wasn't worth the effort. Kendra exhaled subtly, the smallest release of tension. Then, without another word, she turned away. And as she walked past Delilah's row, their eyes met. Delilah didn't say anything. She didn't need to, because this time Kendra saw the difference. And that mattered. The hum of the engines filled the cabin once more, a familiar rhythm settling in as the passengers resumed their own distractions. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. A few heads shook in quiet amusement at the entitled man's outburst, but Delilah wasn't focused on them. She was still thinking about Kendra. That moment, the brief flicker of realization in Kendra's face, hadn't been lost on her. It was subtle, but Delilah had spent a lifetime recognizing these shifts, these moments when people were forced to see what they had always chosen to ignore. Kendra had made a choice, and that choice had weight. Delilah let her fingers rest against the spine of her book, but she wasn't reading. She was waiting. It didn't take long. A few minutes later, Kendra returned. She approached slowly, with none of the brisk efficiency she had moved with earlier. There was something different in her posture. Less rigid, less guarded. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Delilah looked up, arching an eyebrow. Kendra hesitated, just for a second. But then she took a slow breath and said, "I'd like to apologize." Delilah didn't speak right away, because this wasn't just about words. It was about what they meant. Kendra's hands were clasped in front of her, but she wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't trying to rush through the moment. She stood there waiting, willing to stand in the discomfort of what she was saying. That was the difference. "Go on," Delilah said evenly. Kendra nodded, glancing briefly down the aisle, as if making sure no one else was listening. "I shouldn't have dismissed your concerns earlier," she admitted. I I should have listened. I realize now that I handled it poorly." Delilah studied her. "And what made you realize that?" Kendra hesitated again. Then with rare honesty she said, "Because I just saw what it looks like when someone is allowed to demand more than they're owed. And I saw how differently I treated you in comparison." Delilah leaned back slightly. There it was, the thing most people avoided saying out loud. She let the silence stretch between them for a moment, allowing Kendra to sit in it. Then finally Delilah gave a small nod. "Good," she said simply. Kendra blinked as if expecting something more. An absolution, maybe. But Delilah wasn't in the business of handing those out for free. She let Kendra linger there, in the weight of her own understanding, because change didn't come easy, and it shouldn't. And then, with a quiet exhale, Kendra nodded back. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Delilah picked up her book again. This time she actually read the words. The quiet in the cabin felt different now. Not the kind of silence that came from people minding their own business, but the kind that followed something unspoken yet significant. Delilah had spent decades navigating these moments, knowing when to push, when to stand her ground, and when to let someone else sit in their own discomfort. She didn't need an apology from Kendra, but she had wanted her to understand. And now, it seemed like she finally did. Delilah turned a page in her book, her eyes scanning the words. But for the first time since boarding the plane, she wasn't reading just to distract herself. The tension in her shoulders had loosened, and a part of her allowed herself to breathe just a little easier. Across the aisle, the man she had helped earlier was still resting, his daughter occasionally glancing his way, her fingers still wrapped around his hand. She caught Delilah's gaze and gave her another quiet nod, a small acknowledgement. Delilah returned the nod and went back to her book. The flight continued smoothly, attendants moving through the aisles offering drinks, passengers shifting in their seats, some dozing off, while others quietly chatted. But then from the front of the cabin, a sharp sound broke the lull. A phone ringing. It was subtle at first, but then a few more joined in. A ripple effect as notifications pinged across multiple devices. Delilah frowned slightly. That was odd. The plane hadn't landed yet. The man next to her shifted, pulling his phone from his pocket. His eyebrows furrowed as he stared at the screen. A few rows ahead, another passenger did the same. A low murmur spread through the cabin. Something was happening. Delilah reached for her own phone, but before she could check it, an announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're about 30 minutes from our scheduled landing in New York. However, we've just been informed of an important development. For those of you with internet access, you may already be seeing some news circulating. We appreciate your patience, and we'll provide any necessary information as soon as we can." Delilah's pulse quickened. She glanced around, watching as more passengers checked their phones. Some faces looked surprised, others concerned. A few whispered to each other. She turned her phone over in her hand, pressing the power button to wake the screen. Then she saw it. A video. A video of her, of Kendra, of the entire seat dispute. The title alone made her stomach tighten. Black woman denied her seat while airline staff looked the other way. Delilah inhaled sharply. The video had been posted online, and it was spreading. The phone screen seemed brighter than usual. The words in the video's title stark against the dim cabin lighting. Black woman denied her seat while airline staff looked the other way. Delilah's fingers tightened around her phone. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. She tapped the play button. The video wasn't long, just over 2 minutes, but it was enough. It started with the moment she had stood by her assigned seat, asking the man to move. The person filming, some passenger she hadn't even noticed, must have started recording just as Kendra arrived, her voice calm, professional, but unmistakably dismissive. "Ma'am, are you okay with switching seats?" It would make things easier. Delilah swallowed hard. Hearing it again, from an outsider's perspective, made it even clearer. The footage continued, showing the tension in her shoulders, the way she had kept her tone steady, controlled, not because she wasn't frustrated, but because she knew she had to be. Then Kendra's hesitation before finally asking the man to move, the way he sighed dramatically, the smirk he had given her when he finally slid over. It was all there. Delilah glanced up from her screen, scanning the cabin. A few other passengers were watching the same video, their faces unreadable. She turned her attention back to her phone and scrolled down. The comments had already started pouring in. Classic. Black women always expected to be accommodating. Sick of this. The way the flight attendant immediately tried to make it her problem instead of his. Unreal. If she hadn't stood her ground, they would have let that man stay there. Tell me I'm wrong. Delilah inhaled slowly. She had never sought attention, never wanted to be at the center of anything like this. But now her story wasn't just hers anymore. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. A shadow moved beside her. She glanced up. Kendra. She wasn't standing with her usual poised confidence. No, there was something different in the way she held herself. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her jaw tense. She knew. She had seen it. Delilah could tell. The flight attendant's eyes flickered to the phone in Delilah's hands, then back to her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kendra did something Delilah hadn't expected. She sat down. Not in an empty seat, but right across from her, on the fold-down jump seat by the emergency exit. The movement alone was telling. She wasn't running from this. Delilah locked eyes with her, waiting. Kendra exhaled, slow and steady. I saw it. Delilah didn't respond. She didn't need to, because this conversation, it wasn't about the video. It was about what came next. The hum of the airplane engines faded beneath the tension between them. Kendra sat stiffly on the jump seat across from Delilah, hands still clasped together like she was bracing for something. I saw it, she repeated, her voice quieter this time. Delilah let the words settle between them. She had learned over the years that silence had power. She didn't rush to fill the space. Kendra shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know someone was recording. A familiar excuse. Delilah tilted her head. Would it have changed anything? Kendra blinked. She had no quick response for that. Delilah let out a slow breath and looked down at her phone again. The video was still climbing in views, the comments section filling rapidly. People were watching, people were talking. For a long time she had been taught that moments like this, the quiet, everyday injustices, the small slights disguised as misunderstandings, were best left unchallenged. That making a fuss only made things worse. But now the world was seeing it, and that meant she had a choice to make. Kendra exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her temple. Look, She hesitated, then forced herself to meet Delilah's eyes. I messed up. I handled it wrong. And I see that now. Delilah studied her carefully. It wasn't the defensive, half-hearted apology she had expected. Kendra wasn't trying to justify herself. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was just admitting it. It was a rare thing. Delilah leaned forward slightly. You ever wonder why it took seeing yourself on a screen to realize it? Kendra flinched at that. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, like she wasn't sure she wanted anyone else to hear. I guess because I've always thought of myself as someone who's fair, someone who treats everyone the same. Delilah nodded slowly. And now? Kendra let out a dry, almost bitter laugh. Now I realize that I don't. Delilah didn't smile. Because this wasn't a victory. It was a start. A long, uncomfortable start. Kendra rubbed her hands together, exhaling. People are going to see that video and assume I'm some kind of racist. Delilah raised an eyebrow. And what do you assume? Kendra opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth was, it didn't matter what people assumed. What mattered was what Kendra did next. Delilah sat back. You have a choice to make, Miss Monroe. Kendra looked up sharply. Delilah nodded toward the front of the plane. You can finish this flight, pretend this was just a bad day, and move on like nothing happened. She let the words sink in. Or you can decide to sit with it, to actually ask yourself why it happened, and what you're going to do about it. Kendra swallowed. This was the moment. Not the video, not the backlash. This. What happened next would define her far more than that recording ever could. Kendra took a slow breath and stood. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen, she said, her voice steadier now. But I don't know where to start. Delilah watched her for a beat, then nodded. Good, she said simply. Kendra lingered for a second longer, then turned and walked toward the front of the plane. Delilah picked up her phone again. The video was still playing. But for the first time since she saw it, she wasn't worried about what people were saying. The plane had begun its descent, and the usual flurry of movement rippled through the cabin. Passengers adjusting their seats, fastening their seatbelts, stretching before the final stretch of the flight. But for Delilah, the air still carried the weight of the conversation with Kendra. She hadn't expected a complete transformation. People didn't change in an instant. But something had shifted. Kendra had walked away not with the relief of someone who had escaped judgment, but with the heaviness of someone who had truly seen herself for the first time. Delilah exhaled slowly, glancing down at her phone. The video had spread even further. Tens of thousands of views now. The story was moving beyond this flight, beyond this moment. But she knew better than anyone. What people cared about today could be forgotten by next week. What mattered more was what happened after the attention faded. A quiet ding signaled the arrival of a flight attendant over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in New York shortly. Please make sure all carry-on items are stowed, your seatbacks are upright, and your seatbelts are fastened. Delilah glanced out the window. The city was coming into view now, a familiar sight. But this time, it carried a different weight. The man beside her finally spoke, breaking the silence between them. Well, that was quite the flight, he muttered, sliding his phone into his pocket. Delilah turned to him, expression unreadable. Was it? The man smirked. Come on, you made your point, didn't you? Delilah held his gaze. She could have let it go. Could have let him walk off this plane believing that this was about a point, that it had been some performance, some battle for attention. But she was tired of letting things go. She tilted her head slightly. Tell me something, she said, voice even. If no one had filmed it, would you have even noticed? The man blinked, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. And that was her answer. The plane touched down, tires screeching softly against the runway. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, stretching, already shifting their minds to whatever came next. Delilah didn't rush. She took her time. She had spent years learning how to pick her battles. This time, she had chosen to stand her ground, and she knew without a doubt this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The seatbelt sign dimmed and the usual rustling of movement began. Overhead bins creaking open, passengers standing, stretching, reaching for their bags. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering parting smiles, directing people toward the exit. Delilah remained seated for a moment, letting the rush pass. She wasn't in a hurry. This flight had been anything but ordinary. She glanced at her phone again. The video had now surpassed 100,000 views. The comments kept rolling in, some supportive, some dismissive, some outright hostile. The world was watching, and she had a decision to make. The aisle slowly cleared, and Delilah unbuckled her seatbelt, grabbing her purse. As she stood, she felt a presence nearby. Kendra. She was standing a few feet away, near the exit, as if debating whether to approach. The confidence she had carried at the beginning of the flight was gone, replaced with something quieter, heavier. Their eyes met. For a moment it seemed like Kendra might turn away, but then she took a small step closer. "Miss Carter," she said, voice measured. Delilah waited. Kendra exhaled. I wanted to say that I've been thinking about everything, and I know that an apology isn't enough." Delilah studied her. She wasn't wrong. Kendra swallowed. "I don't expect you to believe me, or to think this changes anything. But I do want you to know that I won't forget this, and I don't want to be the kind of person who looks away anymore." For the first time, Delilah saw something real in Kendra's face. Not just discomfort, not just the fear of consequences, but an actual willingness to sit with the truth. That was rare, and rare things, they mattered. Delilah gave a small nod. "Then don't forget it," she said simply, "because I won't." Kendra nodded once, then stepped aside, letting Delilah move past her. The air outside the plane was crisp, the tunnel leading into the airport bright after the dim cabin lights. As Delilah stepped forward, she felt lighter. Not because anything had been solved, not because the world had suddenly become fairer, but because for the first time in a long time, she hadn't let it slide. She had stood her ground, and somewhere in the vast, noisy world outside this airport, someone else was watching. Someone who might find the courage to do the same. She smiled to herself. This wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Moments like these aren't just about a seat on a plane, they're about what we choose to stand for. When we stay silent, nothing changes. But when we speak up, even in the smallest ways, we challenge the systems that tell us to shrink. So what would you have done in Delilah's place? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to decide whether to push back or let it slide? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that make you think, make you feel, and maybe even make you see the world a little differently, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more coming your way.